Montana Territory, October 1877. The first scream echoed off the pine-covered ridges like a bullet ricocheting through the trees. Kellen Eaves had been riding the South Trail, just a few miles from the Bitterroot River, when he heard it. Cold wind whipped through the valley, carrying a sound no man should ignore: a woman's scream, sharp and panicked, followed by the unmistakable snarl of wolves. He kicked his gelding into a gallop, rifle already in hand. Snow had not yet fallen, but the frost clung to the underbrush, and the sun was already slipping behind the mountains. By the time he broke through the trees into the clearing, the scene hit him like a hammer to the chest. She stood with her back to a boulder, long skirts torn at the hem, hands scraped and bleeding. 3 wolves circled her, lean from the end of summer, eyes burning with hunger. One lunged forward. Kellen fired. The first shot dropped the lunging wolf midair. The others flinched, snarled, then turned toward him. He fired again. The second shot cracked through the clearing, and the second wolf fell, twitching. The third fled. Smoke curled from his rifle barrel as silence fell. Only the woman's sharp breath remained. She did not move. Kellen dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against frost-bitten grass. He kept his rifle ready, but lowered it as he approached. Her eyes, wide and dark, locked on his. She was shaking, but she held her ground. "You're safe," he said, voice low. "If you'll stay." She blinked, then let out a breath that cracked in her throat. Her legs gave, and she slid down the rock, landing hard on her knees. He was beside her in an instant. "Easy," he said, crouching. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "No, just. I thought I was going to die." "You are not. Not today." His hand hovered, then touched her shoulder. She did not pull away. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He helped her up gently. She was tall, maybe just under his height, and her hands were bloodied from scrambling through brush. Her dress, once green, was now streaked with dirt and torn at the hem. Her dark hair had come unpinned, falling in waves around her face. She looked around 30, maybe younger. Her mouth trembled, but her eyes were steady now. "I am Kellen Eaves," he said. "I have a cabin just north of here. You can rest there." She hesitated. "You live alone?" "Yes. I am not sure I should trust you." "You should not." He nodded. "But you are bleeding, and it will be dark soon. Wolves will come back. You can ride behind me, or walk out alone." She studied him, then looked to the 2 dead wolves. Finally, she nodded once. "All right." They rode together in silence, her arms tight around his waist as they moved through the trees. His cabin sat on a rise above the river, smoke already curling from the chimney. He helped her down and led her inside. The warmth hit her first. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting gold against the pine walls. She stood in the center of the room, still not speaking. He fetched a basin, warm water, and clean cloth. "Sit," he said, dragging a chair near the fire. She sat stiffly. He cleaned her hands with care, dabbing the cuts one by one. She hissed once, but did not pull back. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. "My name is Mariah Alden," she said. "I came west with my brother. He died 2 days ago." Kellen's gaze stayed on her face. "I am sorry. He was the only family I had left. We were headed for Bozeman. I got turned around after the wagon wheel busted. I thought I knew how to find the trail again." Her voice grew tight. "Then I heard them. You should not have been alone. I know that now." He stood and poured her a tin of coffee. She took it with both hands, warming her fingers. "You have food?" she asked, softer now. He nodded and moved to the shelf. Soon there was a cast iron pan hissing with bacon and beans. He served her first. She ate slowly, watching him. "You saved my life." "Only did what anyone should." "No," she said. "Most would have ridden on." He did not answer that, just poured more coffee. They sat near the fire after supper, the trail dust behind them. She had washed at the basin, her face and hands clean now. Her hair was still wild around her shoulders, but her eyes had steadied. "I will move on tomorrow," she said. He looked up. "Where will you go?" "I do not know yet." Kellen leaned forward, elbows on knees. "The roads are bad. You have no wagon, no horse, and wolves are hunting in packs now." Mariah looked into the fire. "I will not be a burden." "You are not." She turned to him. "Why are you out here alone?" He hesitated. "I used to ranch south of here. Lost too much. Sold the land. Came north. Built this place. Lost what? My brother. And the woman I'm meant to marry." Both in the same winter. Mariah's eyes softened. I am sorry. He nodded. I do not talk about it much. You do not need to. She paused. But thank you. For saving me. He looked at her then, really looked. The firelight played along her cheekbones, her lashes casting shadows. She looked tired but stronger than when he found her. There was something steady in her now, something that had not been there earlier. I meant what I said, Kellen said. You are safe. If you will stay. Mariah blinked. You would let me stay? He nodded once. No strings. Just shelter. Until you figure what comes next. She looked down at her hands. I do not know what comes next. Then stay here until you do. She looked back at him, her eyes searching his face. All right. A quiet fell between them, but it was not heavy. Not anymore. That night, he gave her his bed and took the cot near the hearth. She did not argue. Before she turned in, she paused at the doorway, watching him lay out the blanket. Kellen. He looked up. Thank you. He nodded. Sleep well, Mariah. She smiled, small but real. Then closed the door. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, it was warm. Safe. And neither of them felt quite so alone anymore. At first light, the silence was complete, the kind that held its breath between the pine trunks. Frost limned the window pane, and the wood stove's warmth had softened the air inside. Kellen stirred from the cot, joints stiff from the floor's chill, and listened. No movement from beyond the bedroom door. He stood, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and stepped outside. The river below moved slow and thick with the cold. He hauled water from the barrel and set it to heat, then knelt to split more wood. The axe bit clean, the rhythm steadying his thoughts. Behind him, the door opened. Mariah stepped out, wrapped in one of his old coats, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair was braided now, the ends tied with a strip of linen. That your horse? She asked, nodding toward the gelding tied near the lean-to. Yes. She came closer, watching the blade rise and fall. I can chop, if your back needs a rest. Not this morning. She glanced at the pile he'd already stacked. You always work this early? Winters come hard through this pass. Easier to be ready than to be sorry. Mariah looked toward the ridge. What's past that mountain? Old Trapper Trail runs east. Not much but rock and snow, though there's a town a day's ride down the valley. She nodded once. I thought about heading that way. Kellen set the axe aside. There's no rush. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the edge of the porch and leaned against the post, studying the tree line. Something's bothering you, he said. She tilted her head. You always this direct? I don't see the point in circling. She crossed her arms. I keep thinking about what happened. How close I came to being gone without anyone knowing. My brother buried in shallow dirt somewhere back along the trail, and me just, her voice caught, and she looked away. You're not gone, Kellen said. But I could have been. He didn't try to argue that. Instead, he waited. Mariah drew a breath. I kept telling myself I could manage, that he taught me enough. But I didn't know the land. Not really. I thought I did. Most don't until it's too late. She looked over at him. Why'd you choose this spot? He sat on the porch edge. After everything back south, I needed quiet. Land here's not rich, but it holds. And the river doesn't dry. She came to sit beside him. You miss it? That old life. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. Sometimes. Not the noise. Just small things. Riding fence at dusk. Branding season. My brother's laugh. Mariah studied the horizon. I miss music. My brother played the fiddle. Not well, but he tried. We'd sing when the nights got long. Kellen glanced at her. You sing? I used to. He didn't press her. Instead, he stood and pulled the iron kettle off the stove. Coffee's ready. She followed him inside. The warmth felt different now, not just heat, but the kind that softened the edge of grief. He poured 2 tin mugs and handed her one. She sat at the table, wrapping her hands around the cup. You have work that needs doing? She asked. Always. Then let me help. He hesitated. I can mend, she said. Quilt. Patch boots. And I know how to clean game. You sure? Mariah looked him straight in the eye. You offered shelter. I'll give what I can back. Kellen nodded once. All right. They spent the day working quiet. She sorted the storage shelves, separating what had spoiled from what could last. He took down the snare lines and reset them higher along the ridge. When he returned before dusk, she was kneeling by the hearth, sewing a tear in one of his shirts with thread she'd found in his mending tin. He watched her for a moment before speaking. You always keep your hands busy. It stops my mind from running in circles, she said without looking up. He sat across from her. Mind still running? Not as much. Outside, the wind was picking up again. He stood and stoked the fire. Mariah tied off the last stitch. You ever think about leaving? He shook his head. I've done my share of running. This is the first place I've felt still. She folded the shirt and set it aside. I don't know what still feels like yet. He watched her tuck the needle away. Her movements were careful, methodical, not out of fear, out of habit. It'll come, he said. She met his eyes. You speak like someone who's waited for it. I have. She didn't answer right away. Then, softer than before, maybe I'll wait too. By the time darkness fell, the fire had burned low and the space between them wasn't so wide. She didn't close the bedroom door that night. And he didn't ask why. The first snow came 3 days later, soft as breath and quiet as prayer. Kellen had risen early to haul in the last of the firewood, but found Mariah already outside, arms full of kindling, her boots dusted with white. She didn't see him at first. Her face was turned toward the trees, expression unreadable, like she was listening for something he couldn't hear. You'll catch cold, he said, not unkindly. I needed the air, she replied, setting the wood into the box by the door. And I wanted to see it fall. He nodded, brushing snow from his sleeves. You get snow where you came from? Not like this. Back home it came in hard, wet sheets, turned to mud by noon. This is different. Inside, the cabin held the hush of early morning. The stove crackled, and the scent of sage from last night's stew still lingered faintly. Mariah set about washing the tin plates from breakfast, sleeves rolled, hands steady. Kellen leaned against the doorframe. You stayed up late last night. I couldn't sleep. I found a basket of scraps under the cot. I started piecing something. That quilt. She nodded. It won't be pretty, but it'll be warm. He watched her work a moment. You always make things when you're restless? It's how I keep from unraveling. He understood that. You think you'll stay long enough to finish it? Mariah dried her hands and looked at him. Do you want me to? He didn't answer right away. You've changed the quiet here. I don't mind it. She folded the cloth and set it aside. I don't mind it either. Later that day, they walked the western ridge, checking the traps. She carried the canvas sack and a small skinning knife tucked into her belt. He watched how she stepped, how she scanned the ground ahead. She wasn't careless. Do you believe in signs? She asked as they crossed a stretch of frozen brush. Like what? Tracks leading somewhere. A bird circling overhead. Dreams that feel like warnings. He considered. I believe in weather. In reading land and sky. But no, I don't put much stock in omens. Mariah crouched, brushing snow from a snare. Empty. She reset it carefully. My mother used to say if you dream of fire, someone's coming. I used to think it was foolish. But last week, I dreamt I was inside a burning house, and the door wouldn't open. He didn't interrupt. The next day, she said softly, my brother was dead. He placed a hand on her shoulder, light but present. She didn't pull away. Some things we can't read right. Doesn't mean we caused them. She nodded once, then stood. I keep thinking if I'd done something different, maybe he'd still be here. That thought doesn't lead anywhere good. She gave him a long look. You ever feel like guilt's the only thing holding you together? No, he said. But I felt like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. They didn't speak again until they reached the treeline. By then, the sun had dropped behind the slope, and the sky had turned the color of ash. That evening, she sat by the fire and stitched in silence, her fingers moving slow and deliberate. Kellen carved a new handle for the broken axe, the scent of greenwood thick in the air. I used to think survival was just about grit, she said suddenly. But it's more than that. He looked up. What is it then? Letting someone help carry what you can't anymore. The fire snapped between them. He set the carving knife down. Then you've got that part figured, he said. Mariah met his eyes across the flickering light. Do you? He didn't look away. I'm learning. She smiled, not wide, not bright, but quiet and sure. That night, she closed the bedroom door behind her, but left the lantern burning low. In the dark, Kellen lay on the cot, hand behind his head, listening to the wind scrape against the walls. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to fall apart. By the second week of snow, they had settled into a rhythm that neither named, but both moved within work shared without fuss, space offered without question. The quilt Mariah had begun now draped half the bed, its uneven squares stitched with the steadiness of hands that no longer trembled. That morning, Kellen came in from checking the snares with a rabbit slung from his belt and snow clinging to his coat hem. Mariah had warmed cornbread on the stove and was grinding dried yarrow into powder near the window. She glanced up as he unbuttoned his collar, his cheeks red from the wind. Trap lines empty. Two sprung, nothing caught. Might be the cold's driven them lower. She nodded and poured hot water into a basin. Your knuckles are splitting. Sit. I'll fix it. He didn't argue. She dampened a cloth and pressed it over his hands, the scent of yarrow rising between them. Her touch was careful, but unflinching. You always knew plants, he asked. My grandmother taught me before I could write. She said if I could learn to read leaves, I'd never be helpless. He flexed his fingers as she wrapped them. You miss her? Every day. She tied the last knot neatly. She used to hum while she worked. Always the same tune, even when nothing was good. What tune? Mariah hesitated, then hummed a low, winding melody slow and spare, like wind over dry grass. She stopped mid-note, her mouth tightening. She used to say it kept the wolves away, she added quietly. Kellen looked at her, his voice low. Maybe it did. That evening, clouds pressed low, and the light turned the color of pewter. Kellen lit the lantern early while Mariah stood near the stove, watching steam curl from the pot. I read once, she said, that the cold makes wood fibers tighten. That's why it creaks at night. He glanced up. You read much. When I could. She stirred the pot. My brother pawned off most of our books before we left Missouri. Said they wouldn't feed us. Did you believe him? I didn't want to. But he wasn't wrong. Kellen picked up a scrap of pine and carved it slowly, the shavings curling onto the floor. What kind of books? Natural sciences. Herbal journals. A few volumes of poetry. She smiled faintly. He called them deadweight. I called them mine. He set the carving aside. I've got a copy of Hawthorne. It's missing pages, but it's yours if you want it. I do. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Afterward, she folded the quilt into a cedar chest, then joined him by the fire. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the pressure hung thick. Mariah reached for the tin cup on the mantel, turning it in her hands. You ever think about leaving again? I used to, Kellen said. But I built this place to be still, and I think I've earned that. What about what comes after stillness? He held her gaze. Maybe after's not something to chase. She set the cup down. I keep wondering if staying means giving up on everything I thought I was meant to do. What were you meant to do? Be useful. Be known. Make something that lasts. You think you haven't? I'm not sure yet. Kellen leaned back, his voice quiet. You've made this place warmer than it was. That counts for something. Mariah looked at him then, eyes darker in the firelight. And you? What did you think you were meant for? I stopped asking that a long time ago. But I know this when I heard you cry out. I didn't think. I just rode. She exhaled, slow and steady. I still hear it in my sleep. You don't have to sleep alone. He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the words were out, plain and unsentimental. Mariah didn't flinch. I know. They sat like that for a moment, the fire settling between them. Then she stood and crossed the room. He didn't rise, just waited. She knelt beside him, her hand finding his, the bandages still wrapped tight. Her skin was warm against his palm. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. I know, he answered. The snow began falling again outside, harder now, steady against the roof. But inside, the world had narrowed to this, her breath beside his, the quiet certainty of two people no longer running from anything. The storm broke 2 days later. The morning after, blue sky stretched wide and clear over the Bitterroot Valley, the kind of cold that bit through wool and wood alike, but the kind that made a man feel clean inside. Kellen stepped out to shovel the path, each breath a plume in the sharp air. The snow had bent the pine limbs low, hushed thick across the ridge. He worked steady, not glancing back until he heard the door open. Mariah stood there, wrapped in her shawl, eyes narrowed against the brightness. I stitched a hem this morning without pricking my finger once, she said. That's got to be some kind of sign. He leaned on the shovel. Of what? That I've stopped shaking. She came down the steps, boots crunching through the drift. He watched her walk toward him, chin lifted. She moved differently now, not like someone waiting to be struck. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what a home means." He set the shovel aside. "And I think it's less about place and more about where your absence would be felt." He blinked. "You planning to leave?" "I was," she said. "But then I started wondering what would happen to the stew if I wasn't here to season it. Or if the quilt would look right across your back instead of in a chest." He took a step closer. "And what did you decide?" Mariah looked up at him, snow bright in her hair. "That maybe you don't have to earn every good thing by surviving something terrible." Kellen's throat worked, but he said nothing. She touched his chest, just over the buttons of his coat. "I don't want to keep moving. I want to stand still. With you." Then his arms were around her, pulling her in. She didn't shiver. The cold didn't reach them there. That night, they sat by the fire, not speaking much. The warmth between them didn't need words. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he ran a thumb lightly along her palm, memorizing the calluses, the shape of her fingers. When she lifted her face, it wasn't uncertain. Her eyes were steady, and her mouth found his without hesitation. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't trembling. It was the kind of kiss that came after everything else had been stripped away, the kind that chose, not asked. They married before the spring thaw. The preacher came up from Stevensville on a borrowed mule, grumbling about the climb but grateful for the supper. There were no guests, just wind in the trees and smoke rising from the chimney. Mariah wore her grandmother's brooch pinned to a collar she'd stitched herself. Kellen shaved, put on the shirt she'd mended that first week, and said the words like he meant every one which he did. Afterward, they stood at the edge of the ridge, her hand tucked under his arm, watching the sun fade behind the mountains. "I still wake some nights," she said, voice low. "But I don't feel like I'm falling anymore." He drew her closer. "You're not." They built a life in the quiet, careful way of people who knew what it cost to lose one. She planted herbs behind the cabin, and when spring came up through the roots, they harvested together, her fingers brushing his as they tied bundles to dry. He taught her how to read the sky for weather, and she taught him to read the small shifts in a person's voice that meant more than what they said. The quilt stayed on their bed. When the nights got long, she'd hum beneath it, the tune her grandmother once sang, and Kellen would listen with his hand over her hip, the rhythm of her breathing steady beneath his palm. Years passed. The cabin weathered storms and dry seasons both. They added a lean-to, then a smokehouse. One winter, Kellen built a cradle, and the next spring, a daughter was born with her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet gaze. They named her Lark, because she came on a morning when the snow finally melted and the birds returned to the valley. And when Mariah stood in the doorway, child in her arms, watching Kellen mend a fence post as the sun rose behind him, she thought not for the first time that nothing had been wasted. Not the loss, not the silence, not the long road west. She'd come looking for one thing and found another. Not safety, not certainty, but something better. A home where her absence would be felt, and a love that had never asked for anything but the truth.